Hello, welcome to today's IRMS Schools Group session. My name's Claire Archibald. I'm from the Education Data Hub at Derbyshire County Council. Now, I'm not actually hosting the event today. My colleague Elizabeth Barber at Kent County Council is hosting the event today, but we're having some technical issues. So Elizabeth is very much here and she's going to say hello in the chat and she is going to act as the host, but we just can't hear or see her, which is great fun for me because this is my first ever presentation via the IRMS. So I'm a little bit nervous, but I know Elizabeth is here to help you. So just before we get started, thanks very much to everybody for giving up your lunch hour slot to participate today. I'm really, really glad this has been such a popular session. We had about 80 individuals sign up, so that's absolutely amazing for the schools group after a long period of quiet from the schools group. This is the first in one of 3 sessions I'm going to be delivering over the course of this year, so hopefully you'll join me for all 3. So if you have anything in the chat that you want to post in the chat, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to say hi or whatever, that's fine. Elizabeth will be keeping an eye on that chat during my presentation today. And we also have a questions tab. So if you have any particular questions, pop them in the questions tab and we will make sure that we leave some time at the end to go through your questions. Okay, great. So, as I say, my name is Claire Archibald. I'm a Senior Data Protection Officer and I'm the service lead at a service called the Education Data Hub, which is based in Derbyshire County Council. And my service offers a traded service to schools, not just in Derbyshire, but across the country, to give them support. A data protection officer as a service is my specialty, but I also have colleagues who deal with data management, and I also have a cyber security team that I work with. So I'm a member of the IRMS, and a few years ago I was working in a school. I was a school business manager in a school, so I have been in a school and then moved into data protection. So today we are going to be looking at effective records management in a digital school. So as I say, lots of you are attending today and I know you've got lots of different backgrounds. So we're going to have some staff from very small schools, some staff from very big schools, some staff who've been doing this for a very long time and are really confident, and some who are really new to working in schools. And I know that we'll probably have some larger schools and multi-academy trusts, and I should imagine that we've also got some data protection officers and maybe even some experts who provide data protection officer as a service to a large number of schools. So I've got a wide variety in my audience today, and I'm hoping to make sure that I say something that's relevant and accessible to all of you, regardless of your experience. Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about today. My main focus is around retention of personal data. I am a data protection officer after all. It's where my expertise and interests is. But of course, I know that you also deal with records relating to a whole host of other things that don't have personal data. So perhaps finance, governance and premises management, and they're all likely to be managed digitally by your school. But as I say, I hope you'll forgive my slant on personal data retention. In many ways, it can be the most complex area and is worthy of the most attention, but it is where my expertise lies. So we're going to be looking at retention of pupil records and personal data and where we are at and what the law and guidance says. I'm going to spend some time looking at the outcome of the ICSA inquiry or the J inquiry and how that is impacting on your records management practices. Talking about how we manage both paper and digital records and living in that kind of hybrid world that we're currently in, where we've got a bit of a mix of everything. And then really focusing in on digital records management, so looking at things like digital continuity and hints and tips as to how you can build up a really good strategy. And then talking about the retention policy and how we're going to adapt that and how we're going to plan for your digital school. So first of all, let's just spend a few moments just looking at what schools are told regarding records retention. And this is the sector specific guidance that you have. I'm not going to recite the GDPR laws and the data protection laws at you today, and I'm hoping that you're familiar enough with some of the principles in the GDPR around storage limitation, data minimization, security principle, and all of that, and how those apply to the retention of personal data. But it's useful to hone in away from the Data Protection Act and hone in specifically at what the Department for Education and legislation that's very sector specific says. So the DFE produce a data protection toolkit for schools, and that feels like a sensible place to start. Just so you know, if you hadn't had the news, the DFE actually did update this very recently, so it's well worth having a look at that. But I've just pulled out a few pertinent sentences from that toolkit. And again, hopefully these are all starting to feel quite familiar to you as you're working in schools. You should be only keeping data for as long as you need it, and you should dispose of it when you no longer need it. And you've got to make sure that you have the policies and procedures in place to govern that. And again, different sorts of data are going to need to be kept for different lengths of time. And very kindly, the Department for Education have linked to the IRMS in their toolkit, and they have said that the IRMS does have a toolkit for academies and schools which has more guidance around how to manage that information and around some of the recommended retention periods for some of that personal data. But so far, none of this has said thou shalt have a records management policy, but we've got lots of clues there that say that having a records management policy and a records retention policy is a really good idea. Okay, let's have a little look at some more detail here. So I've pulled out a couple of snips here. There is far more than I could fit on this slide that relates to the retention of information within schools. So in England, we've got the Education Pupil Information Regulations that applies to maintained and special schools. And that's stating that you should keep a curricular record or an educational record for each of your pupils, and that when a pupil leaves to go on to another setting, that record should be transferred. It should move with the pupil. You've also got things like keeping children safe in education, KICSI, and that's really reminding governors that you should make sure that you're adhering to data protection principles. And again, there's that reminder, when a child leaves, their child protection file should be transferred. It should travel with them. And then, of course, the regions of Great Britain have their own rules and regulations. So, for instance, I've pulled out here the guidance relating to Wales. So they've got a document called the Keeping, Disposal, Disclosure and Transfer of Educational Records. So that's available there for Wales as well. And then, of course, we've got a whole host of other legislation. So I've listed those down in the bottom corner: Limitation Act, Social Security Regulations, Taxes Management Act, so on and so forth. Lots and lots of legislation in lots of different places that schools have got to try and manage together. Luckily, the IRMS, the volunteers behind the IRMS have pulled together 2 toolkits. Again, these toolkits have been put together by professionals who work in the field, but we've done it out of the love of records management and because we feel passionate and we want to make sure that schools get the guidance and the support and the advice they need. They're not statutory, they're not the law, they're just guidance, and they're there to help you and to do your own work and as a basis for you to make your own decisions. And we're going to be talking a bit more about the toolkit in a bit. Okay, so I have to mention the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, because that's had major impact on the way that we have been managing records in schools for around the last 5 years or so. So ICSA inquiry, when it was ongoing, there was an order made that nobody should destroy any records that would be relevant to the inquiry. And we at Derbyshire County Council, we provided guidance on retention for all our schools. And you can see the front sheet of that there, the orange and purple text writing. So your local authority might have done something similar for you as well. And there might have been a retention schedule. You might have got a retention schedule from the IRMS. Wherever you got your retention schedule, whether you've listened directly to the words of ICSA or whether you've digested it through a policy that somebody else has provided, or whether you've drawn up something, it's basically making a recommendation that no records relating to child sexual abuse should be destroyed. And actually, we at Derbyshire said, interpreted that quite broadly and said, don't destroy any pupil or staff record. And IRMS here, they recommended that actually schools, once a child is transferred, should consider retaining a copy of a child protection file. So that's the situation that we're at. So if you are a school, it's likely that due to this order, you've got a great amount of personal data and files and records built up. Some of that might be paper, some of that might be electronic. So where are we now? So in October 22, the ICSA report was published. And so the ICSA inquiry was concluded, which means that you can now carry on with your routine records management, disposal and destruction practices. There wasn't a kind of an explicit, you are released, you can now start managing your records. That wasn't actually said, but it was implied, and there were lots of questions. Well, does that mean I can now go back? But so yeah, we can carry on as we were. The inquiry is now concluded. The inquiry made a really important recommendation, and this is going to have a really big impact on schools. Recommendation 17 said that records relating to child sexual abuse should be retained for 75 years. I'm going to call this CSA for the rest of the presentation. So that's a big new thing in schools, because I think very rarely and for very few documents have you had to retain anything for as long as that. If you're really old school, I worked in an old school dating from the 1800s. I know I did have some records that were older than 75 years, but those records were on paper. They weren't in digital format. And so in many ways, they were much easier for me to understand and to work with and to make sure that I kept accessible and usable. In relation to the ICSA recommendations, they also recommended that the government directed the Information Commissioner's Office to introduce a code of practice on the retention and access of CSA records. I did ask the ICO when that was likely to be forthcoming, and I was told that there was no plans as yet, and they had no immediate plans to draw up a code, and that they would be waiting for government instruction for that. So I think it's a fair guess to say that's going to be some time away. So in the meantime, we need to start thinking in schools about how we're going to consider this 75-year retention requirement, bearing in mind that we're increasingly working in digitally based rather than paper-based schools. And let's not forget, in 75 years' time, many of us will be either retired or at peace, and there are likely to have been very many changes to the staffing in your school over that time. So you could have as many as maybe 7 to 10 changes of key staff between now and 75 years' time. So the records that you are creating and managing today need to be future-proof, so that staff in future in your school know what those records are, how they need to be retained, and how they're going to access it. And again, putting that into a digital context, that's all much more complicated than when everything was just on paper. Okay. So let's look back in time. As I said earlier on, I worked in a school. I was a school business manager back in 2016. And back in 2016, I was starting to begin to wonder if it was possible for my school to go paperless, whether it would be allowed. What would I need to do in terms of things like governor minutes and signatures and wet signatures and all of this sort of thing. So we were all talking about these things and beginning to think about how we potentially could move to a more digital world. And we were moving gradually to digital platforms. So a little example is that staff were increasingly not using things like those paper mark books, and they were moving on to things like online assessment trackers. And that was moving on at pace, and a decent pace, at a sustainable and copable pace, and schools didn't have to go faster than they felt that they needed to. The Department for Education was also giving advice to schools around moving to the cloud and the sort of things that you could consider. So we were in this sort of hybrid situation. My pictures here sort of symbolise the move that we've made as a society from petrol cars to electric cars. And this kind of, we're, as you know, in the motor industry, we're in this hybrid situation at the moment, aren't we? Where we've got some petrol cars on the road and we've got electric cars. So we need petrol stations and we need electric charging points as well. So we've got this kind of hybrid situation, but we were moving from it. What happened next? Yeah, COVID pandemic massively changed the world that we were living in and how we then had to deal with records. So where we were moving at a more comfortable pace, our plans of got a gradual adaptation were put into overdrive. We needed to become digital within weeks rather than years. So basically, the situation that's left many schools in is that we've acted and we've had to put digital ways of working, whether we've gone to be an entirely Microsoft school or a Google school or whatever. We've had to act before we've done that planning and we've done that preparation work. And of course, then we've got the ICSA inquiry ongoing during that. We've got this explosion in EdTech providers and all these wonderful multitude of platforms that you can sign on to do this, that, and the other, whether it's manage your safeguarding records or do your times tables test or assess your tracking. All of that has become really complex. And I think for many schools, and I'd love to hear schools that are on top of this, but as I say, many of the schools that I'm aware of, our retention schedule has kind of got left behind a little bit. And we're still treating our retention records as if we're still living in that kind of paper petrol world. So we need to think now about stepping back and making sure our retention and our records and management practices catch up with the reality of what's happened over the last couple of years. I can see questions popping in, but I am going to leave them to the end if you don't mind, because I've got loads of time for questions at the end, and I think there's some really valid questions that are coming up and we can get stuck into them. But I will just move on for the time being if that's okay. Right, okay, so I'm going to talk about this briefly. Physical records, we still have paper records, and of course now we're talking about retaining records for 75 years. We still need to consider how we're going to maintain physical records over very long periods. So papers must be secure, they must be safe from damage, so taking things like paper clips which can cause degradation to paper and take those off, make sure that they are appropriately secured so that only authorised staff can have access to those records, that they're in envelopes, that they're clearly labelled as to what they are, who's authorised to see them, how long they've got to be retained for. All of those things you should be thinking about as you're putting things away to archive if you have them in paper format. We've definitely helped a couple of schools over the last couple of years in terms of damage to physical records, and I've put my little picture there. I should imagine there are many secondary schools in particular that have got real difficulties with finding suitable storage and secure storage for these paper records, bearing in mind you've not been able to destroy them for the last couple of years. So there are lots and lots of advice that you can go out and get in terms of making sure that you are managing your records, your paper records really well. I would say Emily Overton, she's a member of the IRMS as well. She's a really good point of contact for advice on retaining paper records and the sort of things you should be doing to keep them safe and secure. Okay, but anyway, we're all here to talk about digital schools. So let's really move on now to the substantive part of what we're talking about. How are you actually going to manage your records in your digital school? Okay, so the first thing sounds really obvious, but be consistent. Make sure that the way you are retaining documents and that you are storing your records is in line with your school's digital strategy. I should hope that your school has a digital strategy or they're working towards having a digital strategy. It's certainly something that's been encouraged by the Department of Education. And so really work with other staff in the school. It might be that strategy is very EdTech focused in terms of pupils' learning platforms or assessment platforms. But again, think about retention and records management and how you store those documents that you create in line with that strategy. So to state the obvious, if you are a Google school, your records should probably be retained on a part of your Google Drive rather than suddenly creating, I don't know, an Office 365 SharePoint or something like that. So make sure that all of those things are in a coherent way. I see lots of schools who use a little bit of Microsoft and a little bit of Google, but actually those tools are really very similar. And if you're using one, you don't really need to use the other as well. They can usually be brought together. As I say, you might have an individual circumstance where it is appropriate to use both those platforms. And the important thing is that you have a strategy in place. If you don't have a digital strategy, maybe it's time to start that work. Okay, so generally, the concept is in relation to pupil personal data that when they leave your school for another school, so should their data. So their data should generally leave your school as well, unless there are specific reasons to retain it. And you should be getting advice from your data protection officer and maybe your legal team or your insurance team if there's a need in a particular instance to retain a pupil's record once they've left. Of course, and then you've also got that situation where you might be the last known school. So secondary schools are very often the last known schools. It could be that a primary school is the last known school as well. If a child has gone to elective home education, gone into independent education, or gone abroad, you might be the last known school. So you need to think about actually some of those records are going to need to be retained. Okay, so that's just some of the big ticket concepts. A couple of things then. So obviously, if you are retaining pupil records digitally, you're going to need to retain them until the child is 25 or 31 or perhaps even for 75 years, depending on what the records are. So that's definitely longer than 6 years. So anything that is retained for longer than 6 years, you need to think about digital continuity. And I'm going to work on that a little bit more in a minute. So can you keep accessing that? So thinking about those floppy disks that we all used to have, how hard is it now to get data out of a floppy disk? And 75 years time, we're likely to move on again in technology in ways that we don't know yet. So we need to be thinking about making sure that as the years go by, we can still access those things. And some of the software that you're using, the file format to access that data might be really heavily tied to using that software. So what happens if that software is no longer supported? What happens if you decide that you're not interested in using that software anymore? What happens if you're using a particular software as a service platform? your management information system or something like that, and you decide that you want to move on and have something else, how are you going to get the data from the vendor or the platform that you are leaving, and how are you going to transfer it to the new platform provider system or whatever? You need to move that data, or you need to delete it. You shouldn't just be kind of abandoning it on old platforms. You are still responsible for it. Okay. So I promised you a little bit more detail about digital continuity, and I know for many staff listening to this might be the first time that they've heard of such a term. So what does it mean? It means the ability to use and access information digitally in the way that you need for as long as you need to. So I've taken some snips here from the National Archives webpage. The National Archives have got some really good resources on digital continuity. And so I've put the link there. If you just search up in National Archives and digital continuity, you'll get really quickly to the page, and there's loads and loads of resources there. The issue is thinking about, do you need the thing? Yeah, I was going to say the thing was, when you think about continuity, you think about accessing things. The way we've been working up until relatively recently has been with dealing with paper when we've needed to retain it for a really long time, and that's been really straightforward. We've not necessarily needed any special technology to access it. You know, if it gets damaged, you can see the damage that is happening as it's happening. You can flick through it quite easily to find out what it is. You can put it in a sealed envelope with some sellotape on it. You can write retention details on it. You can put it in a box. You can put it in a cupboard. All of those things you can manage paper. So we need to change the way we think and think about planning the same sort of process for those digital files. And I wish I could just say to you, this is how you do it. Having worked in a school, I know you are desperate for help and guidance, for somebody to say, this is how you do it, this is the process that you need to follow. But every school is different, every school does their own thing, you make your own decisions, and so you should be working with experts in records management or data protection or finance and your legal and insurers and your IT manager, working with all those people who can help you to come up with an individualized plan for your school. Planning is essential because change is inevitable when it comes to digital technology. Okay. And I'm sorry, I can't just tell you how to do it. I feel really bad. Okay, so now you've got these records digitally. Again, my analogy of my paper world is really easy to understand how to destroy paper data. You shredded it. You can't just pick up a digital file and shred it in the same way. My analogy here, think about your email box. You've got in your email box, you've got a deleted items folder. Items in your deleted items folder in your mailbox are not deleted items. That's just a folder called deleted items. You can still get in at any time and you can still get your data or your information out. So just taking that thought process and thinking about whether it's your management information system or your safeguarding platform, information in an archived area or a former role area, that's not deleted data. That's just in another part of your system or your platform. So it's really important for you to begin to take some ownership and understand that you're responsible for those digital records, and that you're responsible for actively deleting them when you no longer need them, when you no longer have the lawful basis for holding that information, or it's just not necessary for your business anymore. You are responsible for what you place with your external vendors. So again, there's lots and lots of software as a service SaaS platforms out there. So your management information system, your electronic safeguarding system, your assessment and tracking system. Lots of external commercial companies are now hosting schools' data on their platforms. But you retain the responsibility for that data, and you're the ones who need to instruct those vendors when and to delete that data. really worth me, I've put in big capital letters on my notes here, don't forget your Freedom of Information Act requirements. So the Freedom of Information Act, as schools, you are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Don't forget that that act says that you need to keep records of what data is destroyed. So do look at the Freedom of Information Act and make sure that just as you were maintaining some brief records of what you were destroying when it was paper, make sure have got some kind of brief records of what digital data you destroy and when that is done, and a bit of an audit trail around that. There are some systems that it's really difficult to permanently and completely destroy your electronic data. So in those instances, you should do something which is called put it beyond use. And you should get some advice from your IT support staff in terms of how you can do that. Because obviously things are backed up onto servers are stored. So we need to make sure that we are at least kind of putting a wall around that data so that it's beyond use if you can't actually delete it. And again, your IT advisor would be better placed than me to give you that advice. Okay. So I'm a data protection officer, deal with around 300 schools, and I am never going to pass up an opportunity to remind you about dealing with subject access requests. Okay, we deal with lots and lots of subject access requests and know that schools have got lots and lots of data. So of course, destroying or deleting personal data is a huge part of your data protection compliance regime. But probably what feels much more relatable and much more urgent for you as staff in schools who have to respond to things like subject access requests or freedom of information requests is actually being able to cope with that process and actually having the resources and the time and the ability to respond to things like DSARs when they come in. So I always say a good records management policy is like your best friend when it comes to data protection, and particularly SARS. It's going to make your life so much easier if you understand where your records are and you're only retaining them for as long as you need them. Okay. If you have data that you shouldn't have anymore because a pupil's left or because, I don't know, the retention period for holding that data has expired, and if you still have that data and then you then receive that subject access request, do not under any circumstances go, oh my gosh, so and so's, Mrs. Jones has put in a SAR, I can see that her child left 7 years ago, I should have deleted that data, I'm going to delete it quick now. You're going to get yourself into a whole heap of trouble if you do that. So if you receive a SAR and you still have the data, then you must then deal with the SAR. You can't delete and then say, oh, we don't have it. So it would be much better for you to proactively manage your retention so that it's deleted in line with your policies, so that when the person makes the SAR, you have already deleted the data in line with your retention policy and in line with your own school rules. And of course, destroying and deleting data, whether that's personal data or whether that's financial data or sensitive information about your school, is going to lessen your cyber risk, because should you become subject to a cyber attack, if you are only holding the data that you genuinely need, if you're holding data for stuff that you really didn't need, then you have needlessly exposed a whole host of extra information in a cyber breach or a cyber attack or whatever. So as I say, can't say it enough, best friend in data protection compliance is managing your records really well. I'm a bit passionate about this, sorry, I shall move on. Okay, so let's think about that plan for that digital school. How are you going to start thinking about that? I'm hoping some of the things that I've said have given you a bit of food for thought. So what are you going to do next? So number one, I would recommend that you take some time to revise your retention policy, okay? And tie your retention policy in to things like your information asset register, your records of processing activity. Tie your retention to, okay, well, I know I need to keep this information for this long and it is on this platform. And then, and then work through, okay, my retention, my continuity policy in relation to that is to make sure that I download things as PDFs every year or whatever. So just have your plan, tie it all in together. IRMS guidance is coming out in May 2023. So Elizabeth, hello Elizabeth, I know you're there, and I and a number of other people have been working on that as volunteers in the background. So look out for that. We're going to be releasing that around the time of the IRMS conference, so later on in the spring. I must just warn you, I know that you'll have been used to seeing that as a documented format and a document that you could almost sort of, you feel like you might just put your name on the front and that's your policy done. We're not going to do that format anymore. It's not particularly helpful. There are lots of resources. It's just going to be designed to be a resource that you go into to use to build your own retention policy. So as I say, that's your first port of call, is to really look at your retention policy and think about updating how you're thinking about that retention policy, bearing in mind your records are now digital rather than paper. So use all of that and have that big overhaul. Once you've revised your policy, your really next step is going to be really considering your records relating to CSA. So you're going to need to make sure that you've identified and trained appropriate staff members within your school to review those records and to highlight them and to make sure that those are protected from destruction. So those have got to be tagged. That's going to be a difficult job. It's going to be a long job. You do not need to rush this. You can take as long as you need to get back on top of these things. But again, you really should be training staff members, you know, rather than sitting them in front of a server and asking them to delete stuff, train them and make sure that they look in for those triggers for a longer retention period. Data protection impact assessments are my favourite thing in the world, nearly as much as I love records management. I can't emphasise enough how useful and important a well-considered DPIA is. A DPIA is just a risk assessment, and just keep that in mind, that it's a risk assessment, and that risk assessment, you should be thinking about the risk in relation to the management of your digital records. So the DPIA is an ideal place to pull out those issues out and to flush them out and consider how you're going to mitigate against that sort of risk. The next thing, there are two schools of thought on this. I personally am of the school of thought that we are all records managers now. Okay, it may be back when it was paper. If you were working in a school office, school staff could get away with just flinging paper at you as and when, and asking you to file it away or just go through it and destroy it or whatever. But now we've massively democratized the way that everybody's dealing with records, and so everybody in school has a records management kind of responsibility. So you've got to make sure that in this digital world, as they're creating these digital records themselves, you've got to make it easy for them to understand what constitutes a record and how they can contribute to that record and where they need to store these things. So my little example here is to allocate responsibility. So if you've got a maths lead and you've got some maths platforms that children are using, times tables or whatever, then the maths lead, who's using that platform all the time, who's responsible for it, they're going to be the one who are responsible for the records management and the data in relation to that, clearing down the data. As I say, that is just one school of thought. That's my own personal thing. I think you need to get everybody involved because it's too much for one person to do, or 3 or 4 people to do. You've got to make sure everybody understands how they've got to contribute. The other school of thought is that actually records managers should be dealt with by people who have specialised records understanding, and the responsibility of everybody else is to give that person those records to make sure that they're managing them on their behalf. So depending on what school you fall in, you know, is going to dictate how you're going to set things up. Okay, so that's the end of my talking bit. I've talked for a really long time, nearly 3/4 of an hour. I hope it's been interesting. I can see some questions have been pinging in. I'm longing for Elizabeth to give me a break. Oh, she's here.
Okay, can anyone hear me now?
Yes, you're
Oh,
there.
okay. So I've just found the right button to hit. I was a little bit worried about hitting too many buttons. Those of you who know me well know that technology and I don't always get on very well. So I now know which button I've got to press. So thank you very much for that, Claire. We really appreciate that. That's been very, very interesting. So I have put all the questions in the moderator part
Yeah.
of the tab. But we've got one question in the chat that you might want to answer first, and then we can move over to the others. And that is the ICO's DPI template a good recommended template for school stroke colleges to use?
That's a really good question. So I'm data protection officer for a lot of schools, and I've probably done thousands of DPIAs. We have worked with the ICO template. It's a good template. It helps to set things out in a logical fashion. For me, I find some of my schools found the back end of that document a little bit hard to comprehend in terms of, one of the tables I think in the ICO document talks about identifying the risk, then the next table talks about mitigating the risk, and then the next table talks about, well, who's going to do that work. Actually, what I've done with my clients is I've kind of put those three tables all together. So here's the risk, here's what we've done to mitigate it, and here's who's going to deal with it. So it's a good template, and I think some of the questions are really good and really valid, and they're going to help you to think about those things. But as I say, for us, from a school's point of view, you might like to simplify the back end of that template. That's what I've done with my schools.
Okay, so if we just run through, there's a question in the questions tab, but I have moved that into the moderator's chat so
Yeah.
that we can deal with them all in one go. So the first question was, will the slides be made available afterwards? So I said I would talk to you about that, about how you felt about making those available afterwards. So I will park that one for you to think
Okie
about.
dokie. Yeah.
So the next question was, I was advised to keep any child protection concerns stroke documents indefinitely while the ICSA inquiry was ongoing. Do I
That's right.
keep do I keep this 75 years for all child protection concerns or only sexual abuse concerns stroke documents?
Okay. So the ICSA inquiry has said that only child sexual abuse CSA records, so in relation to sexual abuse concerns, need to be kept for that 75 years. The thing is, it's a classic DPO answer, isn't it? It depends. And so you're going to need to think about, there might be some specific scenarios for a specific child with some specific things where you think, actually, I'm going to keep that for longer than the 25 or 31, 35 years, and you might keep it for longer. The reason why it's 75 years, and I think it's really important to talk about this, 75 years for a school feels really arbitrary and really difficult to comprehend and to cope with. And you might be thinking, oh, why have I got to do this? It's ridiculous. But actually, the ICSA investigation says some really powerful stuff about child sexual abuse survivors and how they come to terms with what's happened to them over the course of their life. And I think if I say that to you, it helps you to realise just why this is so important. So children who have been abused can sometimes take a very, very long time to come to terms with what's happened to them. It may be that that is only something that they can start to consider once those around them who may have been responsible for that abuse, once those people have died, that they feel able to then think about what happened to them as a child. Again, it's something that children or adults might start to think about as they reach kind of the twilight years of their life, as they sort of think about their own, reflecting on their life and trying to understand what's happened to them. So it can be quite a profound experience and quite a difficult experience. So I hope explaining that to you helps you to understand why 75 years, because it really matters to these people. And actually, we as a school have a massively important role in helping sexual abuse survivors to come to terms with what's happened to them many, many years after it's happened.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, can I also ask, is this incidence of CSA in the school or any incident of CSA experienced by a pupil at the school?
I would say the latter of those, so any experience. So if the CSA relates to family abuse, then and the school has a record of that, the school should keep a record of it. It's not just what's actually happening in school, it's what's happening to children that's been recorded by the school.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, and presumably as CP records are transferred, the 75 years only applies to the last school in the child's educational life.
Yes. So as I say, if you are transferring those records, you don't then need to hold them for 75 years, because generally the record should travel with the child and the last school would be responsible for maintaining them for 75 years. But all schools are likely to have to retain these for 75 years, because even in a primary school, you might think the majority of your children go on to secondary school. You are still likely to have 1 or 2 children that have gone missing in education, electively home educated, gone abroad, gone to private education, and you've got nowhere to send their records to. So if you're in that situation, and as I say, I remember when I was in a school, my school was quite small, I definitely had at least 1 or 2 files that I had nowhere to send that to, and I had that responsibility to hold.
Thank you. The next question I think you've kind of covered, but I will read it out in any case. I understand that the guidance is for the education record to move with the child to their next school, but please can you explain why there is no obligation on the previous schools to retain a copy of those records as a data controller themselves? Would they not maybe need to maintain a copy as evidence, etc.?
It's a really good question, and I've really struggled with this. And I can say that I have scoured legislation looking for some kind of law that says schools must retain some records. But honestly, the only thing that schools are required to retain once a child has left and gone on to another setting, the only thing that a school is required to retain, and I'm going to talk about legislation, litigation and things like that in a moment. The only thing that schools are required to retain are things like accident records and attendance registers and admissions registers. They've got to be retained for 3 years. But beyond that, no, there is no obligation. But a case-by-case basis, you might have a particular lawful basis for retaining a particular record for longer. So, for instance, if there had been an accident or some litigation or something like that, or a particular reason for a particular child where you think, I need to keep a copy of those records to defend ourselves as a school, and if there was an accident or whatever, then you can keep those records. But generally, no, there is no obligation to retain those records. And if you do think you need to keep records for longer, you should be talking to your data protection officer about what your lawful basis for retaining that data should be. And you probably should be doing a DPIA for that, because it's likely to, especially if you're routinely retaining records. There's no requirement. That's why I picked out in the very beginning of the presentation what the Department for Education said in their toolkit and what they said in KICSI, because they talk about transferring of pupil records, not copying of pupil records. You don't send a copy to the next school, you transfer the record, it goes.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, what are your thoughts on EdTech and the Children's Code and whether they should adhere to it or not?
This is a really interesting question. Has somebody planted this who knows me really well and knows about a children's code? Okay. So the Children's Code, this is slightly off topic of this, but I think it's fascinating. I could do a whole thing on it. Children's Code came out, and when it came out in draft form, I read it, and I was really concerned that it was going to apply to schools. So I contacted the ICO, a number of data protection officers contacted the ICO, and we said, we're a little bit confused. We think this might apply to EdTech purchased by schools. Please, can you clarify? The ICO then produced a guidance document for schools on the applicability of the Children's Code to EdTech services procured by schools. So I'm not going to search it up now because you'll just see me all searching, but if you just search that up, you will find that document, and that sets out exactly when the Children's Code applies to schools and when it doesn't. It's all around whether the EdTech company influences the nature and the purposes of the processing. And so if they're influencing that, then the EdTech vendors would be subject to the code. It's something I always ask. So when a school is procuring an EdTech platform and I'm talking to the EdTech vendor, I'm doing the due diligence as part of my overall kind of DPIA work, I specifically ask vendors, do you consider yourself to be subject to the code? And if so, what do you do to comply with it? I think that's a really powerful question for schools to be asking EdTech vendors, because they should be putting the burden on EdTech vendors themselves to say either, yes, I am subject to the code and I comply, or no, I don't consider myself to be within scope. Do look at that document from the ICO. It's really, really useful.
Thank you. So the next question is, can we definitely go ahead and start destroying records as per their retention policies? Will legal hold be formally lifted?
So this is something that a number of information records managers asked ICSA. I think, I think we've talked about this, haven't we, Elizabeth? And I think your team have also asked. We've not had a definitive "you may carry on." When that question was asked, I think there was a bit of a, "ooh, I don't know," and I don't think anybody wanted to be the one who could say, "yes, you can." What's your interpretation of it?
As far as I understand it, the legal hold has been informally lifted, but they've put some caveats around it in terms of understanding which of the records which were covered by the legal hold that could now technically be destroyed would now fall under that 75 years, rather than being in the position of being able to be destroyed. And so certainly as a county council, we are taking legal advice at the moment about how we manage that, because obviously some of the records, I mean, I think from a local authority perspective, it's slightly different because you've got that huge range of social care records. With a school, the number of records may be more limited as to which are covered, and the volume may be smaller. So I guess that there's going to be an element of risk management in the process until somebody's decided that yes, the inquiry is complete, so therefore the legal hold has been lifted.
It's really difficult, isn't it? So, as I say, but in the meantime, we all need to be thinking about how we're marking these records. You know, when I think about this is platforms such as CPOMS and My Concern are the two really big ones for all of these safeguarding things now. Are schools effectively using things like the tagging facilities within those platforms to differentiate between safeguarding records and CSA records? So I believe both of those platforms, I know CPOMS definitely does, has this ability to tag these records. So how can you tag your records digitally to mark these out as more, as I say, if you are not comfortable and if you don't think that you should be deleting, at least in the meantime, while all of this is flushed out and we get these information, start thinking about making sure that you're identifying these records as CSA.
Super. And the final question is, would it be possible for you to share the DPI template you use?
No, sorry.
That is a straightforward answer. Oh, hang on.
We do provide data protection officer services to the whole of the country, and if you want to talk to us about being a client, you'd be more than welcome to. And sorry, Elizabeth, for putting that in.
No, that's absolutely fine. And so there is one more question in the questions tab. Our local authority stores documents on behalf of schools, copies of the same record. Who is responsible for retention of these?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think you should talk to your local authority about that. It's not something that Derbyshire would do on behalf of schools. Each school manages their own. The other thing to think about, of course, is, and I've mentioned this, I can't believe I've not, one of the things that's really likely to change, I think it was in one of my slides, but I didn't pull it out. One of the things that's really likely to change to schools over the coming years is maintained schools are likely increasingly to become academies. And so you've got to think about, is the local authority, once you've got academy status, how does that interplay with who's responsible for managing the record?
Okay, thank you for that. So I just can see there's one more thing in the chat. Let me just check. Oh yes, it's just Sarah remarking on that last comment. So I would like to say a huge thank you to Claire for sharing her time and expertise with us. I think this has been an incredibly successful relaunch of the schools group. So thank you very much for attending. We have 2 more events planned for the year. How this is working is that for those of you who are not aware, I'm the chair of IRMS Public Sector, and so I'm looking after the schools group until we can find a new schools group chair. But we've gone ahead and planned events for the year. So Claire will be sharing other elements of her expertise over the next couple of events, and those are on the schools page. And if you aren't actually signed up to the schools group and you're members of the IRMS, please do sign up to those pages, because it will be very useful for us to be able to communicate with people. So once again, thank you all very much for attending. Thank you very much, Claire, for your time, and I do apologise for the slight technical hitch at the beginning, but a button suddenly popped up on my screen, and I suddenly
delighted you joined when you did.
Yes, as I say, those people who know me well know Livestorm and I have a love-hate relationship. So the most important thing was that people could hear you, and that was absolutely clear. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a lovely afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event, hopefully, which is in July. So watch this space.
Thanks for all your kind comments.
So thank you.